Water is central to where and how we build our cities. Rivers, lakes, and oceans draw people in for trade and commerce, habitation, and recreation. In our region, it's Lake Erie and Presque Isle Bay that sit at the forefront. Erie's natural harbor has changed in appearance over the generations, but from the earliest days of the city until now, the Bayfront continues to be a driving force for our economy. Erie County's economic core moved north to the lakeshore. That safe, naturally protected harbor was the perfect place for a growing nation to start its inland navy. But at that time, if you wanted to build a boat, you needed one important ingredient: timber.
The main problem with timber transportation to Erie was in the fact that in the colonial period and up to pre-industrial revolution, a lot of timber transport was done using water. The popular idiom at the time was that a squirrel could climb a tree in Philadelphia and make it all the way to Lake Erie and not have to touch the ground once, which squirrels don't migrate that far, but you get the picture. There was a lot of forest in Pennsylvania. So when those folks got off the boat and started to settle around Philadelphia, they probably looked out in the forest and were like, man, we can cut trees down forever and we're never gonna run out because they're just everywhere as far as you can go.
So it was estimated that at the time of William Penn's arrival, that Pennsylvania's forests comprised about 90% of the state. Really, Pennsylvania and lumber timber have been intertwined at the beginning. In our state's name, Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods. It was named after our forests.
As forested as our state was, not all trees are made alike. Commonly called hardwoods and softwoods, different trees have literally different strengths and weaknesses.
So Pennsylvania has about 6 or 7 different forest zones, as they call them, where you have different species of trees growing in regular composition. The forests along the lake are actually in the mesophytic zone of Pennsylvania. So those are forests that don't require a whole lot of water to grow. That's what mesophytic means. And those forests around the coastal plain on the lake are very much predominantly maple and beech forests. So those are probably the 2 most common species of tree in those forests, both hardwoods. Hardwoods we typically associate with deciduous trees or angiosperm trees. Those are trees that flower and produce fruit. They're more slow-growing trees. It's more durable. So hardwoods make great flooring or things that are put up to a lot of abuse. But the downside is because they are hard and dense, they are also heavier. Softwoods are typically the coniferous species. Trees that have needles instead of leaves, trees that have cones instead of seeds, trees that are typically evergreens that are green all year round. And they are also, because of the way they grow, have an added flexibility. Whereas hardwoods are very durable, softwoods are known for being flexible. Pennsylvania lumber industry early on in the colonial and post-revolutionary period very focused on white pine as the main type of tree that was a desirable timber tree. And when they grew in old-growth forests, all dense and together in a single stand, they were all competing for sunlight. So they grew very tall and very straight without a whole lot of branches on the lower portion of the trunk.
White pine would have been instrumental. It would have been one of the things that would have been fought over, because that white pine in those days, unlike a lot of the pine that we have now, was massive. These were a lot of the timbers that would have been used for masts, and the masts were the engines. So if you control that white pine, then you control movement on the lakes.
The important piece we talked about relative to softwoods and using white pine for masts is that flexibility piece. So when the sails are attached to the mast, they're under a tremendous amount of pressure from the wind. It's basically powering the whole ship, allowing it to move across the water. The white pine lends that flexibility to the mast so that when the winds are really rough and you're putting a lot of stress and tensile strength up against the sails, the mast is more likely to bend and less likely to snap and break. But most of the masts for the larger ships also had oak boards that girded the bottom of the mast.
The hulls themselves were generally made out of a lot of oak, specifically white oak. White oak is a far more ideal lumber than, say, red oak. When the brig was built, as I understand it, it was built with a lot of what's called black oak, which is a subspecies of red oak. Here on the frontier, I think they would have used whatever they had close at hand. What they were concerned with was splintering. When a ship got hit with a cannon, it wasn't necessarily the cannonballs that would kill the people. It was the giant splinters that would blast away. So I've not been shot at with a cannon, but I'm guessing a hardwood would splinter less than a softwood. So this is my assumption. Yeah, but generally hardwoods would have been more desired than softwoods.
The white pine, with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, that really helped the industry take off in Pennsylvania. First, concentrated around our waterways, with logs being sent down through rafts. Mills would set up, operations would set up in certain areas, and towns would be set up around them. But to get to mills, you would use tributaries, and oftentimes they would build dams to hold back the water, and once it reached a level and they were ready to send the logs down, release the water so that they could flood the stream and give it enough water to send the logs down.
Pennsylvania's forest composition changed after lumber industry came through. So post-Civil War up until about 1920 is when we just see the massive explosion in demand for Pennsylvania's lumber. A lot of our old-growth hemlock and white pine forests were clear-cut. The forests that regenerated after those pine and hemlock forests were gone are hardwood forests today. So most of Pennsylvania is in the zone called the Northern Hardwood Zone.
Logging actually was a winter activity. The winter would be the prime time to be out cutting down the trees. Ice really helped move the logs to where you needed to go to transport them. A lot of small farmers would go in the winter when, after their harvest was done, they could work in the lumber camps for a little bit as well.
As these seasonal job shifts occurred, the colder weather gave way to ice harvesting, which took place on several bodies of water throughout the region. Lake Erie, being the biggest body of fresh water, offered plenty of business along Erie's shoreline, though Conneaut Lake boasted better quality. Bragging rights and cold, hard profits were both at stake.
There was an ice house located right there. There was another one located right there where the Cove is restaurant is located. There was another one located up on the top of 2nd and Chestnut Street. And not just Erie, but anybody had, like Lake Chautauqua had it, Conneaut Lake had ice houses. People didn't have refrigerators. Even I can remember even in the 1940s, my grandparents didn't have one. They had an ice box. The iceman, we'd call, he'd come around, plaque would be in the window of the house. In the position the plaque would tell me whether you want 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 75 pounds, or 100 pounds ice. The guy would carry it into your house for you, a ton, dripping water all the way.
Did you put the ice in the ice box?
Yeah,
How'd you do it?
it was easy. Where's my golf club?
In your golf bag.
Yeah, but where's the golf bag?
You just fell over it.
Yeah, I say that.
The ice industry, this new business that started, the ice company, purchased that land around the perimeter of the lake. And so they began the Conneaut Lake Ice Company. The first year that they were in business, the first ice was shipped out in 1881. They shipped it out by horse and wagon. They would bring the ice up and get it on those inclines. And the inclines had chains on either side of them. And those tall towers where you see the inclines going up, those towers had steam engines in them. And the steam engines ran those chains in order to bring the blocks of ice up. And then if you see how there's, as you go up that incline, there's various levels. On this side, in the larger ice house, there's 4 levels. On the smaller ice house, there's 3 levels. That way, with putting down trap doors, they could decide at what level of the ice houses they wanted to store the ice, just depending on where they had room and where they were going to be shipping it out. And so they could decide where it would go, and then you can see it going into those ice houses. The word was that the ice from Conneaut Lake was very clean and very pure. In fact, as the story goes, Andrew Carnegie, who was, of course, a big steel and railroad guy in Pittsburgh, he would only have Conneaut Lake ice when he rode on the train. So it did have a very good reputation of being very clean, and that was part of the reason why the ice company wanted to own the perimeter of the lake, because then they felt that they could control the purity of the water. When the railroad came in, that was a match made in heaven, because the ice company needed the railway system in order to transport the ice. And this was tremendous business for the new railroad that came into town. So they had many years of a very successful business from the early 1880s until the mid-late 1920s, when electric refrigeration became a lot more prevalent.
We had no Interstate 90, no Interstate 79, and most of the travel was by water. But then the railroads came. They started showing up here, and it gave the fishermen an opportunity to spread their fish throughout the markets. So in order to get the railroad to come in here, the city fathers donated or gave them water lots so they could build their docks. And they gave them that whole complex, and the same thing was on the west side. So we had 2 different railroads operating out here, one shipping to Philadelphia, one shipping to Pittsburgh. Well, eventually in 1877, the Pennsylvania Railroad bought them, leased them, and took over the operation and combined it to one railroad. And in 1895, there were about 250 fishermen. By the end of 1919, there were up to 2,500 just working out of the city of Erie. There was 120 boats spread out, mostly where we are right now. There was 86 million pounds of fish taken just out of Erie's harbor alone. And that was worth about $8 million at the time. I imagine in today's money, it would be worth about $320, $330 million.
Like any good trading port, it was the transportation that would make or break the success of Erie. Trains took hold as the major overland hauler. Local industrialists, like Charles M. Reed Jr., took advantage of this, forming companies to manufacture and run railroads, including the Erie and Northeast Railroad Company, Erie City Iron Works, Climax Manufacturing, and the Pittsburgh and Erie Railroad Company. After some violent conflict over track width standards in the gauge wars, Erie was connected around the region by rail. It was the speed of trains that proved most crucial to Erie's industry, because when you can move goods quickly, you can sell perishable goods to markets farther away. For a city on the water, one product comes to mind: seafood. In Erie, fish would become our economic core for decades to come.
It was a maritime town, and it was a materials transfer town. As soon as people invented engines that could go all the way from Buffalo to Detroit, what was going to be happening here except for fishing? Because this is just a perfect place for fish. There's 2 different lakes that are joined in the middle, but you don't see that there's a joint by a moraine that goes from the base of Long Point to the base of Presque Isle. The western lake is shallow, which is good for some species, and the lake by us is deep, which is good for some other species. But cisco and whitefish were the two favorite fish, and the reason they were the favorite fish is you'd catch them, you'd slice them down the middle, leave their heads on, because people like to see the fish they were buying, take out the guts, fill them with ice, pack them in a mixture of ice and sawdust, and send them to market. And the whitefish were a little stronger than the cisco. The cisco people liked because they were milder and they were smaller. So whitefish could be, 2 feet long. Cisco would be 18 inches long. So there was a fellow at the other end of the lake by the name of Nash that invented the gill net. And the gill net is a super powerful fish catching system. And if we're going to use fish nets, we have to figure out how to get out there and tend them.
As the city started to grow, this being a port, a couple of ships were built. Eventually, the technology caught up. It was a man in Erie called William Loomis who built what was called a Erie boat.
The Erie boat and the Mackinac boat have a lot of similarities. So they have really cool plank-on-frame construction. So they would be steam bent frames rather than sawn frames. Take something like white oak is kind of ideal because it bends really easily. You take the oak, you cut it into the dimensions of the frames. You put it in a really long box, and the rule of thumb is an hour for every inch of thickness. So if you had a 1-inch thick frame, you'd leave it in there for about an hour, and you'd take it back out, and you would press it against what's called a mold, bends it to the shape that it needs to be in, and then you can apply the planking over top of that. The planking would have been a softwood, something that also would have steam bent well.
It can be anything from 25 to 35 or 40 feet long. Always has 2 masts, and each sail on the mast is the same as the other. So you can use 2 sails to get out to where you want to go, and they're the same size, so that if you're going to be a fisherman, you don't really care how shiny your sails look, but you want them to work, so you have 3. There's 2 on the boat and 1 at the sailmakers being repaired, so you can keep going. So you take the 2 sails and sail out to the net, drop 1, and then you can use the mizzenmast sail to move around from net to net and tend the nets.
Its sailing methods would allow for sharp movement compared to a square rig ship. So it could tack and jibe easier and quicker. It could point up into the wind much higher than a square rig ship. So you could cut your lines and run with the wind till you got to a safe harbor. So with a boat like that, it would be very maneuverable compared to a big square rigged sailing ship, especially with people that live and work on the ship constantly.
As the fishing industry flourished, technology had to keep up with it. The wooden sail-clad Loomis boats gave way to steam-powered steel-clad fish tugs. Running faster and stronger than their wind-powered ancestors, Erie's fishing industry was poised to accelerate through the turn of the 20th century.
And if you'd get to the bottom of why Erie might have been at one time called the steam and boiler making capital of the world, it's because every one of the fish tugs that were here had a steam engine in it. There was people making boilers from East Avenue to Powell Avenue in little places, and every person was figuring out how to put them into a boat. And slowly but surely, the wooden boats got clad with metal, which made them a tad bit safer. And then arguably either in Erie, Pennsylvania or Port Dover, this is an argument you can have with old guys, somebody came up with the idea of forget the wooden frame, we're just going to continuously seam metal. We'll hire some schmuck to hold the flux because we don't care if he dies of cancer, and I'll run the bead of welding. And the best example of that is the Lady Kate. That's a continuous seam welded Nolan boat.
And again, they were open bow. And these guys would go out there, they did pull in these nets by hand. They literally have to, and they had a lot of fishing late in the season, December or early March, and it was miserable and hot and rough. They were getting wet. They'd have to pull these nets in by hand. You lose a few overboard once in a while. Well, then a man in Erie by the name of Crosley developed a net lifter, or it's a winch type of thing, that they were able to winch the nets in, and they were a gill net. You winch the gill nets in. and they could take the fish off as they're pulling it in. And that was the standard for the industry. And then eventually they closed the whole boat and just had openings in the side, very similar to the Joanne, which is right behind me.
My name is Rob Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of At the Lake Ministries, and I also serve as clergy in the Western Pennsylvania Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church.
My name is Dan Wilson. I'm Rob's father, and I'm here because he lets me.
So the Joanne M, the boat was built in 1979, was built by Harold Pash and Pash Shipbuilding out of Erie. It was the 200th hull that was built by Harold Pash. Harold did not live to see its completion. So this boat has been in Erie throughout the course of its existence. It was originally commissioned by the Munch family to serve as a commercial fishing vessel, and was powered with an 871 Detroit diesel with a 2-to-1 Allison transmission gear. And it weighs about 58,000 pounds and can hold 700 gallons of diesel fuel.
Erie had a lot of concentration of boats, more than Canada did. And of course, as these guys were spreading their nets out, and I mentioned, these nets could be a quarter mile long. You take they said, one thing I read said, if you took all the nets from out of Erie Harbor and stretched them end to end, it'd reach from here to Philadelphia.
Everyone wanted Lake Erie's fish. No other Great Lake compares to the harvest Lake Erie produced. Large fish merchants like Alfred Booth further increased the pressure to harvest, even if it meant forgetting about that pesky Canadian border and raising the ire of the Canadian Department of Marine and Fisheries.
Alfred Booth from Chicago. He was a grocer and a fishmonger, and he would go to a place like Sandusky, Ohio. He would make all the guys who were independently fishing be a part of him. So he had a fleet in Erie, Pennsylvania at one time with several boats. And people got mad at him. They unionized against him. There were fish strikes. It was his influence that created a system where Canadian fish could be imported to the United States duty-free. He was the guy that made that work.
Alfred Booth, what he would do is he would take the independent fishermen, buy their catch, of course, using the railroads, would ship it to Chicago or ship it all over the world. And they would just sneak into Canadian waters and set their nets. Well, the Canadians got a little mad about it. So they got and put together a patrol boat called the Petrel.
So the fish wars happened when a fellow by the name of Dunn, who worked for the Canadian government, declared that he was going to go to war on the American fish pirates. And his first seizure was an American fishing party that was on the wrong side of the Detroit River, fishing for whatever. He took them and took their boat and made them pay bail to get out. But then he moved the Petrel down to where the real action was happening. That was Erie, Pennsylvania, epicenter of gill netting. And what those events did during the fishing wars, people were shot and killed. And there were a couple of collisions where people were killed. The Canadian revenue boats were steel. They'd ram you and sink you, and you'd sink.
He was pretty aggressive. He used to confiscate nets, and he would try to chase the boats and arrest them because they could confiscate the boats, and they did a couple of cases. They took over a Booth fishery boat out of Erie and took that out there. They took another one, and they never got it back. In fact, it was a steamboat, and it ended up operating in Niagara River someplace.
Dunn became a minor celebrity in Erie. He would come over here in his boat and tie up and have press conferences and eat at the Erie Club and run around and talk to everybody about these people that he's doing a war against the pirates who were all from Erie. And he would get front page coverage. Everybody loved him. He was a sort of a kind of a charismatic guy.
But in addition to the Petrel, he got a faster boat called a Vigilant, and it was pretty fast. And they opened up on one of the boats with a Gatling gun. According to the stories, the fireman, he had to keep throwing wood and coal into the boiler to keep it going faster. He passed out from exhaustion when he got over the line.
And finally, the two countries put their heads together and they created a new rule, and that was you couldn't catch a Canadian fish if you were an American.
By this time, we had our own revenue cutter, and they sat down and worked it out. And then there was, the legislatures and all that other, like politics get involved in.
The crackdown by Captain Edward Dunn continued into the 19-teens, but by the last decade, the American poaching schemes had leveled off compared to the peak near the turn of the century. The Great War was on the horizon, and as important as fishing had been, it didn't compare to the war in Europe. At the same time, concerns were being raised that the fisheries were being overfished, with catches in 1906 being only half of catches from 30 years previous. Those fish tugs wouldn't all go to waste, though. The 18th Amendment put them back in use by rum runners looking to cross that border once again. We never wanted to stop profiting off the lake. It is the never certain question of ecology versus economy. At what point does our environment's need for survival outweigh the want of profit? The fish are not eternal. We saw that with the blue pike and the cisco. The forest is not eternal. The woods Pennsylvania was known for have been harvested over and over again, and the white pine is gone. Even the ice is not eternal. When was the last time you saw the bay frozen over? Erie's economy is moving further from its industrial past, and tourism and service industries cover the Bayfront. We have relied on our lake for centuries, and she has always provided. Will we be able to provide what she needs in return? We can certainly hope. We can certainly try. Chronicles is made possible by a grant from the Erie Community Foundation, a community assets grant provided by the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, support from Spring Hill Senior Living, and the generous support of Thomas B. Hagen.
We question and learn.